everyone to Let's Talk. I'm your host, Ingrid Lockley, and our special guest today is attorney Joseph Trigilio. He is with the Loyola Law School Innocence Project, and he is here today to talk about the Innocence Project. Attorney Trigilio, thanks for joining us today. How are you, sir?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Awesome, awesome. You know, what sparked me to want to kind of talk about the Innocence Project and learn more about it is because I have read, I don't know how many stories of men and women, and in some cases youth, who have been wrongfully convicted, and they're really a fighting for justice, to have their cases reopened and heard again. What is the Innocence Project about?
The Innocence Project is a national organization in New York City working to free the innocent and educate the public about the causes of wrongful conviction. Within that project, there is also, like mine, I'm at the Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. There are a number of innocence projects sort of under the national umbrella that are part of what's called an innocent network. And
Mhm.
we're in every state in the country. In California, we have a few. And so we're here to work locally to try to free folks who are in prison wrongfully and who are innocent in state custody and in federal custody.
Okay. I want to ask you a question from a legal standpoint. What does it mean to be wrongfully convicted? And what are the reasons behind wrongful convictions?
Right. So a wrongful conviction, I mean, you might get a slightly different answer based on who you
Mhm.
ask.
Yeah.
Some would say only if you're innocent can you be wrongfully convicted, if you are
Mhm.
factually just weren't there. I would say the definition of wrongful convictions could be slightly broader than that, and folks who are convicted based on a unconstitutionally unfair trial, some sort of unfairness where the jury really didn't get to consider all of the facts, that could be a wrongful conviction also. And I think you can have things like a wrongful or grossly unfair sentence. That's not something the Innocence Project focuses on. So a wrongful conviction is just a situation where the jury gets it wrong and someone is sitting in prison when they shouldn't be. In terms of the causes of wrongful convictions or the causes of why innocent people wind up in prison, there are a number, and thankfully, through the work of Innocence Projects, we've been able to do a lot of study of the data on what is the drivers of these wrongful convictions. And there are a few. So, the first would be eyewitness misidentifications is a huge
Mm.
driver. State misconduct, things like concealing helpful evidence to the other side is a
Yeah.
big driver. Presenting unreliable forensic science that jurors are enamored with, but is not reliable science that improperly points to an innocent person is a big driver. And I think what touches on each one of those things is systemic racial bias, a
Yeah.
system that is primed and historically where discretion in the system is used against people, black and brown people, disproportionately, and that's been borne out through data over decades. And that drives really all the other causes, if you think about it, in
Yeah.
terms of why certain folks are targeted and why certain folks don't get the representation they deserve to expose bad evidence. Those are some of the main causes.
Yeah. I want to read something to you. This is a annual report from 2023 from the NRE, which is the National Registry of Exoneration. And I just want to read some numbers to you and for the viewers to kind of listen to as well. So for other races, ethnicity, it says 79 exonerees. For Hispanic, it says 456 exonerees. For whites, 1,146 exonerees. For African American blacks, it says 1,926 exonerees. So just hearing those numbers, when you mention about race and bias, that says a lot. What do you gather when you hear those numbers?
That the the disparate impacts of who is wrongfully convicted is on primarily black folks around the country.
Yeah,
And that
yeah.
there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, demographic, where folks were forced to live here in LA.
Mm-hmm.
Folks were not allowed to live in certain parts of town and overly policed in certain communities. But what I take away from those numbers is this is not a neutral system we're in. We're seeing implicit and explicit biases on certain communities that are targeted, over policed, and ultimately wrongfully convicted. And that's going to be at the level of just economics in terms of
Hmm.
where people have to live. It's going to be at the level of policing and who is being over policed. It's going to be at the level of um, who's getting prosecuted and charged with certain crimes and who isn't. You know, if you are um, a black person, this came out of a study out of Georgia. If you are a black person accused of killing a white person, you're 11 times more likely to have a death sentence brought against you than if you are a white person accused of killing a black person, right?
Wow.
So prosecutor discretion being used in biased ways, it has an impact on who gets bail and who doesn't, and it has
Hmm.
an impact on jurors and sort of decisions by jurors. Race creeps into all of that, and all of it's in a way that goes against historically impacted and oppressed communities in our country, which, as you know, is tends to be black folks.
Yeah, and it is an unfortunate thing. Now, that being said, are you seeing any changes when it comes to uh, conviction for African Americans versus the other races that I have mentioned? Are you seeing any changes with that, or is it getting in you to you? Is it seem like things are not getting better?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know recent. So all of my cases, we're looking backwards, right? We're looking at folks who are already convicted and are challenging their convictions. So I don't have a real good sense of sort of what's happening now, other than cases that are coming to us. What I will say is there is thankfully more of an awareness that
Okay.
certain communities are over policed, that certain communities are susceptible to disparate treatment. That's since 2020, right? Since the Black Lives Matter movement really took hold, since we started getting documentation on iPhones and video footage of unarmed black young men getting shot in the streets, right? Since that stuff came out into the public for the first time, we're now seeing finally jurors willing to acknowledge that, you know what, maybe police officers lie sometimes in their police reports. That is not something when I started practicing 18 years ago was very frequent to hear, is that jurors would always believe the cop versus the defendant. We're seeing a change in that narrative thanks to
Hmm.
how exposed these wrongful convictions are. And at the policy level, we are in a positive way, we're seeing some states enact racial justice acts, racial justice bills. California has one. It's called the Racial Justice Act, which is an attempt to address those kind of racial disparities in the system, but both for folks facing trial and folks who are already convicted. So if your conviction, if you can show your conviction was the result of just racially discriminatory bias in a few different ways, you can have your conviction or sentence modified or reversed. That's a positive development. But I'm hesitant to say that we are at a good place now because we have to be on guard. And as I'm sure you and your viewers know, we're in an era right now where there is this myth of burgeoning crime across the country. There is a backlash on reform efforts locally, statewide, and especially nationally. So it's
Yeah.
very easy to backslide. It's very easy to spotlight, one case and present some misinformation that causes a complete backslide. So we have a lot of work to do. And unfortunately, I think right now our work is to stop that pendulum from going back to the days where the racial bias was truly something that we couldn't address.
Yeah, because one may challenge that and say, well, you know what? With all the technology, you're doing video shootings and you taking pictures of things like that, it still seems like it doesn't really help when it's time to go to court or have your case heard. So one may, challenge that, um, and hopefully things will get better in the future. But right now, some may say, hey, you can take pictures if you want to, but it seems that still certain ethnicity and races are still uh, wrongfully convicted for a crime they have never done. So yeah, some may really challenge that.
Absolutely. I mean, we're going to see. I mean, this is a problem that's not going to go away.
Yeah,
And as long as there's discretion in our system and people being able to make, especially prosecutors
yeah.
and being able to have wide discretion and outsized power, you're going to
Hmm.
see that discretion used in ways that are bias against certain groups of folks.
Yeah. I want to ask you a question, Attorney Chilito. When it comes to cases that have been overturned, now can a prosecutor actually go back in and have the case overturned again? Have you seen situations like that for those that you have helped where victory has they triumphed, the victory has come into play, and all of a sudden, they're called back for some other evidence that were missing or that came about?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is going to be a state by state situation, but I have
Mhm.
seen it. I've had cases in Texas and in California, and I have seen that happen. The prosecutor can appeal a finding by a trial court that someone was wrongfully convicted. They can appeal that in federal court as well. And so, unfortunately, yes, there's a limited options when someone is convicted based on perhaps insufficient evidence or really outrageous conduct where a judge can say you're not allowed to be retried. But even that can be appealed. That finding itself can be appealed to a higher court. So yes, it's a roller coaster that's just awful for these men and women who are put through that, where you feel like you have your day of justice and then it's pulled from you. Um,
Yeah,
I don't see that much in California in our cases where we've had a finding of factual innocence. That's have stood, and we haven't seen that reversed by other courts. But I've seen it happen in Texas, and it's possible. It's certainly
yeah,
possible.
yeah. As I read your website, and again, as I said, all the stories I've heard and read and continue to hear about, you have some men and women, and in some cases, youth who have spent 10, 20, 30, 40 plus years
Yeah,
in prison for a crime they have never committed. And so I just can't imagine to spend all that time and fighting for your rights and just sitting there and hoping that someone will hear your case and have it reopened again. That's got to be devastating.
it's heartbreaking, and it's what is crushing is not just those. I mean, thankfully, the people that we've just this past 2 months we've exonerated two men who had spent 40 plus years in prison each. And it's a beautiful thing, right? That they can come home, but it's an awful, tragic thing what they've been through, the trauma they have endured. They're not the same people. I can't even imagine, right? But what really is heartbreaking are the folks we're currently working to help, and we haven't been able to help, who are still in prison, having done 40 plus years, who are just wanting someone to listen to them. And that's another tragedy is once you are convicted and once your appeal is final, you lose your right to a lawyer at that point. And so these men and women who may be innocent, they have no access to an attorney. There's no one there to help them if they're indigent and poor. We exist, the innocence clinics like myself exist to try to fill that backstop, but we can only touch the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, yeah,
And what bothers me a lot is so many of these people who are in for so long, they lose hope. They stop trying and advocating for themselves sometimes. And sometimes the reason they're wrongfully convicted is they couldn't advocate for themselves at trial because they have mental impairments. They aren't they aren't as able to learn the law, and so they can't write a letter to us. I don't know how many of those people are. So as many people as we can help, there's so many in there who just lack the resources to know to write to us. We can only take a certain amount of cases. We're a small clinic ourselves. There's just the need is so much larger to help folks in there than the resources aren't matched with no right to counsel for these folks.
I want to make sure. So when you have a client or inmate who is fighting for justice, and he's sitting there or she is sitting there, are you saying at some point they absorb all their time of trying to get the help they need? They're just sitting there. They did everything in their power. No one seems to kind of reach out to them. Is that what's going on with a lot of these inmates? Is that they just went for appeal? They're being told, no, you've done this crime. You have to sit there. Is that what you're saying? Pretty much is going on with a lot of them.
That's the standard. I mean, you go through an appeal. An appeal is very limited. It's just looking for an error at trial. But someone who's innocent, they may lose the appeal. They may have had a fair trial, but the jury got it wrong. So they lose hope at that stage. And then, yeah, then they're on their own. Now, the exception is if you were sentenced to death. I spent about 15 years of my life representing folks just on death row. And in that situation, you do have a right to a lawyer. And so those folks get counsel to
Okay.
engage in what's called habeas corpus proceedings, where you can present evidence like innocence. But if you're not sentenced to death, if you're sentenced to 200 years, 100 years, 50 years to life, they do not have a right to counsel. And it's up to them to advocate for themselves, to navigate a really complex area of law. Sometimes they get help from other inmates. They're called jailhouse lawyers that can step in. But many of them are left to writing all of us,
Yeah.
as many clinics, as many places as they can find. They write the ACLU, the NAACP nationally, and they write the Innocence Projects. But if you don't get responses, it can be really be dejecting, and you have to be extraordinarily resilient to continue fighting for yourself. Our motto at our clinic is there's no disposable people, and we really strive to reach out and write to everyone who contacts us, whether we can help them or not, and at
Hmm.
least hear them. Even if we have to say, look, I'm sorry, we don't have the ability to help you, at least they hear something.
Yeah.
Because not hearing
Absolutely.
anything, I would imagine, and I've heard, is probably one of the more dejecting things there is, where it just seems like no one's even listening to you.
Yeah. Yeah. I would think that's a mental strain. I would
I,
think
I
that it's
mean,
just,
to put it mildly, right? Like just
yeah. Yeah. I would think that's a wear on them mentally that, they're trying and they just can't get the help that they need.
right.
Um, I want to talk about the statute of um, limitations just a little bit here.
Sure.
And I know you're based out of Los Angeles. I'm aware of that. But
Okay.
but how does that come to play when it comes to someone being exoneration? Someone being exonerated. How does that play into the whole picture?
Yeah, so the statute of limitations is just it's a depending on what state you're in, and I
Mm-hmm.
practice in federal court too, and there's a really strict statute of limitations in federal court. You have a certain amount of time to file your habeas corpus petition. In California, there is no statute of limitations. It's you have to file it without reasonable delay. That's the rule. I mean, I guess you can call that a limiting statute, but you have to file your petition without reasonable delay. However, there's an exception if you can show that you're innocent, and that will excuse filing late. Many states, if not all states, many states have strict statutes of limitations like 1 year or 2 years or 3 years to file your claim of innocence. But many of those states also have an exception if you can show you're innocent. The problem is the bar they make you show your innocence which through is incredibly high. So you have to essentially just have DNA or a video of someone else doing it. And as we know from exonerations we've had, sometimes it takes a lot of resources to develop that level of innocence that someone in custody doesn't have to overcome the statute of limitations.
Right.
Where the statute of limitations I see is really detrimental is when you want to challenge your conviction at the federal level. When you're in
Mm-hmm.
states like Texas and Alabama and Mississippi and the South and Arizona, Nevada, state courts may give short shrift to your petition, and you have a right to go into federal court and have a federal court review your conviction. There's a strict 1 year statute of limitations in that case, and it's unforgiving.
Mm.
And that's many. I've seen many folks sentenced to death who blow it by a day or even an hour, and their federal review is done, and they might be executed because of it. It's unforgiving. Now, in the past 10 years, there's an exception for innocence for that statute too. But again, the bar to meet it is so incredibly high at that stage that sometimes they just don't have the resources to prove it.
Yeah, that's horrible to hear that. That one day or so can kind of change the whole dynamic of the situation. That's horrible to hear. It's really tough. And that's and once again, the federal level is a little bit more um
Strict.
the stricter than
Right. And
the
it's this
state
it's
level.
because, I don't know if you remember the Oklahoma City bombing back in
Absolutely.
1996.
Yes,
After that
absolutely.
after that incident, Congress passed a bill called the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act that transformed the ability of folks in prison to challenge their sentences with
Mhm.
the goal of speeding up the death penalty. And what that did was it impacted not just folks sentenced to death, but everybody who's claiming innocence, and enacted really rigid draconian rules signed by President Clinton at the time, into law. And it's resulted in so many innocent folks not getting federal review just based on this rule that really is about having state rights, like giving states the ability to do what they want without federal oversight, and not giving federal review to these folks. And so that particular law is one that's in need of reform, nationally.
Now, have you seen any changes since that time, or since then? Have they made some adjustments too? I know it needs some reform. It needs to be reformed, but have they started working on reforming that, or where
You
they at
know,
with
I will say it's
that?
gotten worse with the current Supreme Court. That law has gotten interpreted more and more um, drastically against the person in custody. It's gotten worse. I was heartened and I was hopeful during the last couple presidential cycles, not this last one, but in 20, I guess 16 and 2020, the Democratic platform included some language about repealing parts of that bill. Very happy to hear. But again, the pendulum for this last round has swung so far towards, we need to be tough on crime. It kind of fell off, and so that's unfortunate. I hope to see that back on folks' radar as a real problem.
Absolutely. That's something definitely should kind of continue working on. I want to talk a little bit about compensation and restoring rights.
Right.
How does that come to play with those who have been exonerated?
So it primarily compensation is again a state matter. So I can only speak to sort of California in this way.
Mhm.
Each state has their own compensation package. Some are very low, some are better, more generous. California's is about $140 a day. And you have to basically get a finding of factual innocence to be eligible for that compensation. And if you can do that, you can get compensated. We had a gentleman who served 15 years to life, for a murder he was not even there at the scene for. And he got compensated recently for upwards of $700,000 to $800,000. It's hard to say that makes up for it, but it does allow him to sort of have a new life and get on with his life. So there's that state sort of statutory compensation that's available for folks. If you can, again, get a finding of factual innocence. There's the lawsuits, however, are very limited. Some folks are able to file lawsuits to get additional compensation. And that's going to be, I'm sure you've heard of immunity, qualified immunity.
Yeah.
That's very
Mhm.
difficult because if the prosecution committed misconduct that resulted in your wrongful conviction, you cannot sue and you cannot get any compensation. They're absolutely immune. But if you can show, the police or the investigator in your case committed some sort of really egregious misconduct, then it's possible to sue for compensation.
I want to ask you, so those who are fighting for restoring rights and compensation, I just want to back up a little bit. So are you saying that they have to prove that once they out, they still have to prove that they've done nothing wrong? Is that what you're saying?
Right, exactly. They have to get a finding of factual innocence. So you could have your conviction overturned for a number of reasons, right? It could be the prosecution hid some evidence, but not all of it means you're innocent, right? It could just mean you had an unconstitutional trial. To get compensation, you have to make an additional finding of factual innocence.
And does that include your right to vote again, as far as restoring rights and all that good stuff,
Yeah,
the whole
in
thing?
California, yes. Again, that's going to be very dependent on the state you live in.
Okay, each state is different when it
Right.
comes
Each
to that
state's
as
going to be
well.
much different in how they handle that. That's
Yeah.
right.
Um, any new changes with any of the laws as far as it pertains to wrongful conviction that you want to kind of discuss with the viewers?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mhm.
Because we're seeing it. I'm seeing policy is such an important tool. And our clinic does a ton of policy work here in California, and I'm seeing it juxtaposed to other places like Texas, like Alabama. Um, and Justice Sotomayor just pointed that out over the summer on how this is, and where this really comes up is with junk science, is where I've seen
Mhm.
it. I don't know if you've heard of something called the shaken baby syndrome.
I
Um,
have. Yes, I have.
it's There's a gentleman named Robert Robertson who's facing an execution in Texas for killing his own child, And the evidence against him was simply this diagnosis by doctors of that the child suffered a certain constellation of injuries. And the testimony to the jury was, well, the only thing that could ever result in those injuries was is abuse.
Mm,
He got a death sentence for that. That diagnosis has been exposed as unreliable and faulty and even false. And in California, as a result of just understanding, we helped sponsor and got passed a bill that allows a conviction to be vacated when there is a significant dispute about junk science and there's a
mm,
consensus that is formed that it's wrong. And so we just had a case a few months ago, a gentleman named Jose Oliveras, who had his conviction vacated for the same type of medical science, convicted of killing a young child, his girlfriend's child, spent 11 years in prison, loving father, the entire family um, testified for him, didn't believe he could ever do anything like it. But you had some doctors saying, nope, it has to be abuse. You have this set of injuries. Turns out we now know from documentation in iPhones that
mm.
children suffering just falls or accidents have the same injuries. And so we had his conviction vacated through a law that acknowledged the science. But so many places in the country, including Texas, including other places, the law is so far behind where the science is that these people are still languishing in jail with these convictions, including Mr. Robertson, who's facing getting executed soon over it.
Wow, that's horrible. I want to ask you a question. With the advancement of technology and with the DNA, why is it still so hard uh, for those who are again wrongly convicted? Even though we have DNA that says, "Hey, they they are not attached to the crime." Why is it still difficult to even get out that situation? What are the reasons behind that?
Well, I think the big reason specific to DNA is just DNA is doesn't come up very often in crimes. Like there's the vast majority of cases of criminal cases, of murder cases, don't have DNA as a dispositive issue. It's great if you have a case where there's real intimate contact between the victim and the
Mhm.
perpetrator. But here in LA, we see a lot of cases that purportedly or supposedly involve gang violence, drive-by shootings. There's not going to be DNA in those types of situations, right? If it's just a shooting or a robbery of a 7-Eleven or something. And
Right.
so the vast majority of exonerations lately have been non-DNA cases
Mm,
because it just DNA is not something you have available to you. Now, you're right, DNA technology is getting more and more and more sensitive, so it's possible to get DNA off of something like a shell casing, but it's still difficult and rare. So I think that's specific to DNA. But to your point more broadly, I think what you might be speaking to is our system is really geared towards the jury's verdict being the main event, and after the
mm,
jury renders its verdict, finality being the main concern. Is we all now need to move on and respect the jury's verdict. And so standards in place by other courts are make it very difficult to overturn a conviction because of the sense of finality and the sense that, well, you had your shot in front of the jury, that's all you get.
yeah.
That's the sort of abstract reason. But if you're looking at just DNA, we just don't have that type of dispositive evidence. So often, prosecution cases against our clients have no forensic evidence at all, just eyewitnesses, right? That's
Mm.
all it is.
Now, do you guys also represent clients who are youths, 17, 18, that age group, and some even, I'm sure in some cases even younger? Do you guys kind of
Absolutely.
represent them as well?
Yeah, absolutely. If you have a claim of innocence, we'll represent you no matter the age. I mean, that raises a whole other set of issues when you're a juvenile offender in terms of those are the folks who most often confess falsely because they're more susceptible to police interrogation tactics. And so we see our young clients, folks who committed or convicted of committing an offense young, they're the ones who can really admit to doing something they didn't do because they just want to go home to their mom and they're being
Yeah.
subjected to these interrogation tactics and their brains haven't formed even, much less being able to overcome and be resilient against these really tough interrogation tactics. So Youth offenders or juvenile defendants are at a much higher risk, in my opinion, of getting wrongfully convicted, particularly with when you have confessions.
Yeah. What is the percentage that you would say with your program, Attorney Trujillo, that you would think that you have the dishonorees? Is it like what's the percentage that you think, or that you know that the triumph, those who are actually successful? What
You
is
know,
the
I
numbers?
don't have a number on that. I do not have a number on the number I have seen based on capital cases is that
Mhm.
up between 5 and 10% of the inmate population are innocent and wrongfully convicted. A huge, huge number. That statistic is just for folks on death row,
Mhm.
which means I think the number in actuality for everyone is much higher because again, those folks on death row have lawyers to really challenge and prove their innocence.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
that's the best I have. I don't have a sense, to be honest with you, and that's why I don't really want to have those numbers in my head because I want to look at each person who comes to us
yeah.
on their own and try to hear them and keep my own discretion and biases coming into play,
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely, absolutely. Now, for those who are not in Los Angeles, is there a nationwide number they can kind of call, say, hey, you know what? I know someone who can use this help with the Innocent Project, get in touch with someone with the Innocent Project. Is
Yeah,
there a
absolutely.
number
Innocence
you can
Project is,
provide?
yeah, is a national organization. You can just Google Innocence Project, it'll come right up. In fact, that's the one that most people know about. It's based in New York. But if you want, but they don't get involved in every local case, right? They're a national organization. They do a lot of policy. They do DNA. But if you are sitting in Richmond, Virginia, or out somewhere, Mobile, Alabama, or somewhere,
Yeah,
Google Innocence Project and your state because there will be a local Innocence Project and member of an Innocence Network, either affiliated with a law school or a nonprofit, doing innocence work in your state, and that's the
okay,
one you'd also want to contact. Now, the National Innocence Project can also put you in touch with those folks, but you would be working with folks in your particular state.
okay. In closing, I want to ask you, what if someone is watching and they say, you know what? They all say they're innocent. What do you tell those viewers?
I just have not seen that play out. I've represented many folks sitting on death row. I've run it before as a federal public defender. I've represented folks here, and I just do not see that where everybody claims they're innocent. You see the folks who are claiming they're innocent do so from the very beginning all the
Mhm.
way through. It's very hard to persist in your innocence through a system that's designed to beat you down and to break you down. It just doesn't happen often. And if it does happen, it's not like we all bite. There's such little resources. The way we work is we screen a
Mhm.
case first, and then if it passes our screening, we investigate the case, and then only then do we have confidence of innocence. Do we take on the person as a client? And so it's a lengthy, extensive process before the Innocence Project will take a case as our client, and before we go out and say that they're innocent, because we want to make that decision ourselves. But I just can't believe it because I've seen it with my own eyes that you don't have folks just up and down claiming innocence. I think a lot of inmates know that resources are thin and don't want to take the resources from everyone, as hard as that might be for folks in the
Mhm.
public to believe. But I've seen that.
Attorney Chulo, that was a wealth of information and on the viewers, and I appreciate that. Now, if someone's in the Los Angeles, California area, how can they reach the Loyola Innocence Project? What's the contact information for them?
Yeah, thank you. So we are always looking for supporters, volunteers. We run entirely on donations, so we appreciate any help or support, as well as if you have family members or anyone who's incarcerated. Projectfortheinnocent.org is our website. You can write to us at 919 Albany Street, Los Angeles 90015. And you can call us at 213-736-8141. We're always happy to talk, and we have volunteer opportunities, events, and we're always looking for new supporters because it allows us to do our investigations and get the experts we need to help our clients.
Great information. Attorney Trigilio, I'd like for you to come back at some point in time to kind of talk about any changes with the laws, if there are any changes that come about. And also maybe have a client come on and to talk a little about after exoneration. How's life after being
Absolutely.
free? Well, we appreciate that. Again, everyone, you heard Attorney Trigilio about the Innocence Project. He's provided the information if you're in Los Angeles, California area to reach out to his office, as well as those who are in other states. Attorney Trigilio, I thank you again for coming on to Let's Talk. And those, if you want to reach Let's Talk and have a story or any topic that would be useful or resourceful to the viewers, you can contact Ingrid Lockley at letstalk.org. That's Ingrid Lockley at LETZTALK.org. Again, thanks, Attorney Trigilio. And
Awesome.
thanks,
Thank you for
Ingrid.
having me. I
You're
appreciate you
most welcome,
spotlighting this
sir.
topic.
Thank
Thanks
you,
so
sir.
much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.